Hi, and welcome to GCs in the House, a podcast spotlighting general counsels. I'm your host, Lena Guo. In my conversations with GCs, we discuss how they got in the top legal seat, obstacles that they had to overcome along the way, and how they are tackling new challenges. Hi, and welcome back. My guest today is John Simon, Executive Vice President, General Counsel, and Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer of Pacific Gas and Electric, one of the largest utility companies in the U.S. Established in 1905 and based in Oakland, California, PG&E is a publicly traded company that provides natural gas and electric service to approximately 16 million people throughout Northern and Central California. John joined PG&E in 2007 and has held several senior roles within the company, including interim CEO. Today, John talks to me about risk-taking in his career, how his HR experience created the opportunity for him to become a GC, and what it was like to lead through crisis. Let's begin. Good morning, John. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Good morning, Lena.
I'm so excited to speak with you and to learn more about your career path. PG&E is a household name for many of us Californians, especially in Northern California. I believe you've been with the company for 17 years now, and you've held several leadership roles within the company, including interim CEO, as well as executive vice president, corporate services, and human resources. I'm really interested in learning about how you got to where you are today. Let's start at the beginning. Where did you grow up and how did you become a lawyer?
Well, Lena, I grew up in the Chicago area, and both in the northern suburbs, sort of near Northwestern, but also in the city where my father lived. And you assume that I have grown up. Some say that I haven't completely grown up. I think that on the question of how did I become a lawyer, it's a good one. I think as I think about it, I think the seeds were planted pretty early for me on being a lawyer. I actually wanted to be a baseball player as a kid, but I didn't really have the athletic skills to make the major leagues. And then I thought I wanted to be an astronaut, but I definitely didn't have the math skills for that. And I do remember it was about sixth or seventh grade when in my social studies class, we studied the Scopes monkey trial and read Inherit the Wind, and we watched the movie with Spencer Tracy. And I remember thinking, that's what I want to do. And it was right around that time. It was, I think, the election of, now this is going to date myself, the election for president between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. And our social studies teacher had split the class in two and had each side advocate for one of the presidents who were running. And I know I had Jimmy Carter, and I really loved doing that. This is something that probably wouldn't happen in class today, but then we were encouraged to sort of take sides in a political battle, and I really enjoyed that. And I think that stuck with me. In high school and college, I was definitely attracted to writing, to reading, to stories, way more so than sort of the math and sciences. And I think that solidified the ideas that I wanted to use words and stories in a career. I also remember, and this really influenced my thinking at the time, in the basement, my father had a book about the Loeb and Leopold trial. It's a famous murder trial in the 1920s in Chicago. And it was a trial where Clarence Darrow made maybe the seminal speech opposing the death penalty. And it's worth a read if people haven't read it. It's really an amazing speech. That it was really his closing argument in the trial that went on and on and on. But I was really taken with the way Clarence Darrow would use words and tell stories and make an impassioned plea. And I think sort of all those things together some sort of way ultimately led me to law school.
That's such an interesting turn, given that you originally wanted to be a baseball player and then an astronaut, and here you are, a general counsel. And you have been in so many different roles. I mean, you've really done the gamut for essentially what a lawyer of roles that a lawyer can take on, right? You were an associate and then a partner at a law firm, and you've even been in HR and legal and interim CEO. So what tell us a little bit about how you ended up in house. You have a background in as a commercial litigator, is that right?
That's right. Well, I think, it's interesting to think about that. I haven't thought about it that much. But I'm a big believer in, and I remember my dad used to tell me, you're going to do different things and have different experiences and work with different people. Don't grab on to one thing. I think I was very stressed in college about what I was going to do. And it turns out that he was right. I've had a bunch of different experiences. I think what led me in-house, if I think about it, is sort of tying those together. You take sort of kernels and nuggets from each one, and it kind of leads to different thinking. So after law school, I worked, well, I had a clerkship with a federal judge. I worked at a big law firm. I worked at a small trial law firm. I did quite a bit of pro bono work. I maximized the cases that the courts would assign for pro bono representation. We had panels in the various districts where I was working, and I really loved that work. And I also had a chance in those experiences to work around some really good business lawyers. At the big firms, at the small firms, these were the kind of lawyers who were sought out by clients to solve problems, and the problems were all over the place. And I think it was the different experiences and sort of the problem solving that I saw that led me to really want to go in-house. I didn't actively seek an in-house job. I got a bit lucky when a former colleague at the large law firm I worked at, which was Proskauer Rose, became a general counsel, and he called me up and said, "Hey, I'm general counsel of this company. We went public. This is in the mid 90s, and we really need a generalist to do everything that I can't do." He was a legal department of one, an amazing lawyer. His name is Jim Kaufman, who's a general counsel today somewhere. But Jim called me and said, "I'm going to do the corporate transactional stuff, but I need someone to do everything else." And at this time, I was a partner in a firm, but thought, wow, that really appealed to me because of kind of the opportunity to do everything. When you're in-house, everyone's your client. And I remember thinking when I was with my firm and in litigating cases, we would litigate cases for months, if not years. And at the end of that, I was always left thinking, wanting a little bit. We learned all these things in this litigation case, things that maybe could have gone differently from the beginning. Had they gone differently, maybe we wouldn't have wound up in that big litigation. But oftentimes the clients were ready to move on. They weren't really interested in working with me as outside counsel on starting to fix the problems in the first place. And so when Jim called about the in-house job and sort of adding all these things up together, I sort of jumped at the chance, and I moved from a law firm as a partner. I was in Rochester, New York, out to Denver to be the number two in the law department of two of this public company that was a technology company. I really knew nothing about their business, but given that chance, I grabbed it. That's what led me into a company. But then I'll say, Lena, my path to general counsel was definitely not linear. You mentioned a couple of the things. So I started in the company as the number two in the legal department, and at one point, after a couple of years, I moved into HR and I left the law department. Ultimately, I went back to law after a number of different positions, but that's how I got in-house. How I ended up as general counsel or in the HR functions, even a bit of a different story.
Yes, and I would love to hear more about that. I just have so many questions in response to what you have just said. You not only made a move in-house, but into an industry that you didn't know much about, and also relocated geographically. So from New York to Colorado, and from a being a law firm partner to in-house counsel. That is a lot of change. There doesn't seem to be many law firm partners who make that in-house transition. Looking back, was that what was the transition like?
I have to think about my mindset at the time I made that move, but sitting here today, I think, first of all, I was a partner, but trying to think of how old I was. I had been a partner for a couple years. I was in my mid 30s, early to mid 30s. I had a young family, and I did have this feeling that I was really just at the beginning of my career. I think going back to the experiences of working for a judge and in big law and small law and public interest and commercial, I really came to form a view that I was only as good as the experiences I was having. I know I've always had that feeling. I don't really know where that comes from. I thought that being a partner in trying cases and big litigation was going well. I still had a lot to learn, but I guess I felt like I wanted more varied experiences than that. The job in Denver offered an opportunity, a little bit of a sky's the limit, situation. That we're talking about a company that was relatively young, one that had gone public just a couple of years before, and the opportunity where everyone's your client and to work on solving problems on the front end before they bloom into much bigger issues, I found really appealing, and it was something that the business people in this company really were looking for. So I definitely, sitting here today, realize, looking back on that I took a risk in doing that. I gave up the certainty and the steadiness of the partnership for the uncertainty of a new company, but I found that exciting, and I thought the value, and I've seen this in my career a couple of times with changes, the value isn't always about the money. It's about the experience, the people you're going to be working with, the problems you're going to see, the opportunities you're given. To me, that's the value in your career and the movement and what you learn and how good can become, because you get good at something by doing it, and the more experience you're given or you have and the chances you have to do is worth its weight in gold. And I know I felt that then. Looking back on it now, I'm glad I did it, but I think that's my thinking. It was a little bumpy, to answer the second part of your question. Going in house, it was a little bit of anything goes. This was a technology company. This was at the very early stages of its growth. So, Wild West wouldn't be true, because they had pretty strong governance, but in terms of the business prospects, it was early, and I felt a little unsteady with that. Um, I think, again, I needed to get the experience of meeting people, building relationships in the company that went a long way to make me feel like I was in the right place. And then from there, things just took off a bit.
That makes a lot of sense. It's still tough to wrap my head around it, especially because it did sound like, given the stable situation that you had at the law firm, this could have was themed very much like a leap of faith in many ways. And when it was just you and Jim, and you were recruited to do everything else, so to speak. As a commercial litigator, was it a steep learning curve? What were some of the in-house matters that you had to handle, and manage? And what were some of the areas that you had to really get up to speed on or leverage outside counsel on?
It was a pretty steep learning curve, and I'll explain a little why that is. I think I've learned through these changes that I've had that a lot of the learnings can feel daunting if you get intimidated by technical rules, but that ultimately a lot of lawyering and business counseling comes down to understanding, listening, and common sense. That's easier said than done, but I do believe that to be true. So the company I went to in Denver, which is called T-Tech today, but was called Teletech Holdings at the time, it's still a public company, is and was in the business of running call centers, data centers, providing software and technology to support customer care operations in many different forms. And it was a very, and to this day is a very far-flung international business that was operating in many countries. So labor and employment was very, was a central focus of the lawyering. Not the only. There was a number of commercial issues, the ones you might imagine with a public company in it that had, 20,000 or more employees. I had to learn a lot about doing business in other countries. I did need to rely on outside counsel in country to understand things like labor and employment rules that are very different in the United Kingdom and Australia than they are in the US, around the rules of labor organization, which are very different in, for example, South American countries. I did work pretty hard to build a network of law firms in those countries that both I could rely on, but also could communicate well with me as an American who had understanding of maybe how we do things here, but not how we do things there. There were a number of issues, transactional issues that I didn't have training in, but with Jim's help and guidance, and we were able to hire some others to help us as well in-house, that I learned around live indemnities and warranties and commercial insurance. I needed to learn that. Working with Jim, who was an outstanding disclosure lawyer, I just by watching and helping, I learned a lot about the rules around disclosure and the SEC. These are things I deal with quite a bit today, but at the time I didn't. So I think there was a lot of learning by watching, by doing. Teletech, being an entrepreneurial company, was willing to give me, some space to figure things out. And there was quite a community of interest there in really growing the business. So it was an environment that was rich in learnings. I think I just was very hungry to do that. Again, where that comes from, I was the kid who couldn't do any pull-ups in gym class. I don't know. I didn't read business books. I found it very appealing, very relationship driven, and I liked it.
And you mentioned relationship driven. Was that part of the reason behind your transition from in-house counsel to becoming the SVP or of HR at T-Tech?
I think that had a lot to do with it. That's an interesting story in and of itself. So I was basically the deputy general counsel at the time that I moved in to run HR at Teletech. We were a small law department, but as I said, many of our legal issues, much of the work I was doing around business counseling involved labor and employment domestically, internationally, in some form or another. And we had a CEO who was the founder of the company named Ken Tuckman, who's still the CEO, who is really an amazing leader who invented the business and who had a passion for really building things. And, he pushed hard, and he wanted always the best. And I think Ken was very disappointed in HR. I think he felt like it was very rules based, not possibility based. And he saw the value in recruiting and training and in almost offering those HR practices as services to teletext clients. So he really wanted something different. And I was the lawyer who was working on a lot of the issues. And I had ideas that from time to time I would share. And there came a point where Ken or Jim said to me, I don't remember which one, why don't you do it? That's a good idea. Why don't you do it? And I didn't see that coming. And it caused me a lot of pause because I was reluctant to leave the law practice. Even in-house, I felt like my identity is a lawyer. I've trained to be a lawyer. But Jim Kaufman, again, the general counsel, really encouraged me. And just like moving from Rochester to Denver, I took a risk. I took a leap. I thought that, well, this is different, but this is, when doors close, doors open. I'm going to leave the law, but I'm now going to be looking at these things differently, working with different people. And I was not trained in HR. I was trained as a lawyer who dealt with HR issues. But it was difficult, but it was exciting. And I look back on my career because I'm way more towards the end of it than the beginning now. And there were a number of times I think I was willing to take a risk like this. So I did it. I quickly realized that not being trained in HR, that I needed real HR pros around me. And I think I set out to build a function that had that expertise.
And your experience transitioning to HR is very uncommon, at least from what I've seen. Nowadays, though, what I have seen is that more general counsels are being tasked with taking on the HR function, so they're wearing both hats. What words of advice do you have for these GCs who all of a sudden have inherited an HR department, even if temporarily?
Understanding the differences between the functions is important. There is a lot of commonality, but there's important differences. One of the things that needs to be managed, for example, is just practical questions like, if you're the general counsel running HR, when are your communications privileged and when are they not? And having some good structure around that to make sure that you're not claiming privilege when the communications aren't for purposes of providing legal advice. I think a practical thing that I learned and I mentioned is to make sure that on the HR side of things, you have HR professionals who you trust, and who you let be HR professionals. In other words, I think HR is an art and it's really important. I've certainly learned that and believe that. And there's certain freedoms to design people programs, career development, creating an environment at a company that's one where people feel they can be their best selves to raise issues about anything, having an HR practice that encourages sort of the free marketplace of ideas in a respectful way. I could go on, but you want to nurture those things and make sure that legal constraints that are necessary around compliance and risk management don't overly bleed into the creativity that it takes to build a really thriving people practice. I'd get advice around that. I came to really depend on the HR pros to teach me. Really wanted to create an HR environment where people felt free to raise issues, to disagree, to tell me I was missing the point. I think just having that sort of open culture on the people side is really important. Not to say you wouldn't want it on the legal side either, because you do, but I just think they're slightly different and you want to honor those differences.
Thank you for that insight. That as lawyers, folks don't necessarily think about, even though HR and legal do work hand in hand. But as you mentioned, there are some very different considerations in how the departments are run. And so you eventually made the transition to PG&E, but when you made that transition, it was in an HR capacity, and then you eventually moved back into legal. So tell me a little bit about how you were able to make that transition.
That's true, that's what happened. And the interesting thing is, I really believe that it's the HR experience that equipped me to be the general counsel and probably created the opportunity for me to move back into legal. I know it sounds a little backwards.
Huh, interesting.
But I really believe that, because what the HR job did for me, first of all, it was a bigger platform in terms of the number of people I was dealing with. As the deputy general counsel at the Denver company, I certainly was working across the company, but when you're running HR and you're overseeing people-based programs around compensation and talent management and succession planning, and you're running the process around promotions and benefits, when you're looking at how to build a talent pipeline, you're just working across the company, building relationships, meeting people, seeing issues in ways that as lawyer I really wasn't, certainly not going anywhere near the depth I was as the HR chief. Moreover, as the HR chief, I was dealing with the board of directors in a different way, not just as legal advisor, but as people and culture advisor. And so fast forward, I'm doing this at Teletech. I'm running HR for maybe 5 or 6 years. And even during that period, I came back to run legal as the interim general counsel while I was also running HR, and helped the transition to a new general counsel at TTEC. But it's true, I was becoming an HR person, and that's how my resume spoke to me. As reluctant as I was to give up the law, I felt like I was now an HR professional, and PG&E came calling for the HR job, not the legal job. And it turned out that this was around late 2006, and the company PG&E was looking at going through a significant growth period, and potentially looking at whether PG&E might operate out of state, which turned out we didn't do. But they were interested in somebody who had HR background at a company with a large workforce, which Teletech by then I think was up to about 50,000 employees. So I came to PG&E to run HR in 2007, and I was attracted to PG&E because it was a highly regulated business in an industry I knew nothing about. I mean, utilities and energy was very different than technology and call centers. I liked the opportunity to be in one state. I was traveling all over the world with Teletech, and PG&E is Northern and Central California. And it was sort of another one of those risk pivot moments where things were going well at Teletech. I dreaded telling my boss I was going to leave, but this opportunity to try something completely different in a different place, I just found really appealing and attractive. And HR at PG&E was very interesting, and all those kind of people programs that I was talking about, as well as a very interesting labor practice. Is two-thirds of PG&E's workforce in California is unionized, and the company has really deep partnerships with our unions. And the opportunity to work with union leaders just was something that was, I thought, really interesting. There was a lot of policy around that, and but I do think that over time, my experience running HR led me back to legal. I'll pause here so I can take a breath, but I think there are reasons for that, which I can share.
Yeah, so and so far it sounds like what you have been chasing in your career really has been just the challenge and the opportunity
Mm.
to learn, because the recurring theme I hear is you are unafraid of risk, taking risks. Us Granted, they were educated risks, and just looking for areas in which you could continue to stretch and grow. And this is the second time that you have jumped into an industry which you had known nothing about,
Mhm.
which is really, really interesting. So yes, how did you end up getting tapped to be PG&E's general counsel when you were still in the HR function?
Well, I like at Teletech, working HR at PG&E gave me a really broad perspective of the business. I mean, I would say an ultra deep perspective, because you're working with leaders of many different functions on, you know, these really important programs, completely centered around people, whether it's hiring, talent development, succession planning, the whole range, union negotiations, benefits, retirement, everything. I mean, everything the company's touching finds its way to HR one way or the other. And so I think that really accelerated my learning of the business. I was out and about in the business a lot, meeting with employees for various reasons. I was going to work sites. Um, I not only got to know things faster, but I think I got a perspective on what was going well and what needed improvement, very quickly. And the other thing the HR position enabled me to do, and I think many business positions could do this, not just HR, but it really accelerates the relationship building. I did need to work with people, with leaders in the company, to really understand what their pain points were, what needed changing, what they needed more of. And it's just, in a way, I don't think I would have done had I started as the lawyer. The other thing it did was I was working closely with the board of directors on all these people related issues. So I got to know them in a way that was a bit more fluid and open than just maybe the usual corporate governance or legal issues that a board might interface with the general counsel on. So things at HR were moving along, and at some point at PG&E, I picked up some additional responsibilities on the business side, which included overseeing the communications team and the regulatory team. And then there was a transition at PG&E where, now this was 2017. So I came to PG&E in 2007. I was running HR and then these additional corporate services functions till early 2017. And when there was a CEO change, the outgoing CEO, who I had worked for as the head of HR, and the incoming CEO, who I had worked with as she ran one of our large operating groups, asked me if I would make the transition to law. And I had been building succession plans behind me in HR, and would I be open to do? Well, I sit here today and say they said, would I be open to do it? I think it would have been a bit more directive. We want you to do it. You've got good successors behind you. Let's make the change. And I have to tell you that I would. I was as nervous about going back to law in that role as I was leaving law and going to HR, because by then in 2017 I had spent, the last 12 or so years, which were very formative years for me, if not more, I guess it would be more than that, in this HR capacity. And I thought, wow, I'm still licensed to practice law, but I'm not up to speed on my CLEs. I've got to, I haven't been running the legal function for such a long time.
Right.
And actually, I had never been the general counsel outright before. I had been the interim at my last company, and it's certainly trained in it and been around it. But I think, it was another risk-taking moment, I guess, in my career, and one that my managers had confidence in me, and I think their confidence gave me some comfort that it was okay to make the change. And so that happened. And in March 2017, after I cleared and came up to speed on my CLEs, I became the general counsel at PG&E.
That's incredible, because senior level attorneys have asked me if they transition into a business role, how difficult would it be to come back into the law practice or to be pinged for an attorney role. So it's wonderful that in your case, you've proven that it's possible. As you mentioned, it must have been very daunting, given you had left the law practice for almost a decade. What helped you transition back? Aside from getting caught up to your CLEs, was it just getting additional help from outside counsel and relying on the legal team initially?
I think it was all of those things. I will say this: I wasn't distant from the legal issues at the company, so I was around them enough, and as a member of the executive team, participating around meetings enough that I think I don't want people to think it was like I was a green pepper and was going to become a banana. I was adjacent to legal, and I did certainly have good relationships, at least I thought, with a number of the lawyers in the legal department. That said, no one ever said this to me, but I always wondered whether the legal team was a bit skeptical of me. The GC who I took over for was a pro, and I do think they might have had some skepticism. So I did rely heavily on the pros that I felt we had in the department. PG&E is a place where historically we've had a strong legal department of highly tenured lawyers. We have that today. And I also knew, and probably my experience taking over at HR at Teletech helped me, where there I knew I needed to surround myself with the pros and give them plenty of room and listen and be open to feedback on what I was doing right and not doing right, that I needed to do that at PG&E. I was a known quantity at the company, so at least I had I think a fairly good understanding of the company, where it was, the path we were on. But I did rely a lot on others. Especially certain outside counsel that I work with to this day on some of our most difficult things turned out to be enormously helpful business advisors and coaches for me. And I was very, very open to that. But I definitely felt the stress going back. I took it very seriously, as I should, but I spent a lot of time on it, wanting to make sure that I was doing the right things. I probably overdid it in some ways. And as I said earlier, Lena, I really think it was the HR experience in hindsight that really equipped me to be the general counsel to the fullest, because that HR experience at PG&E really helped me develop deep relationships with others and a really good understanding of where the business was. And I think to be effective as the general counsel, the more I can align my work and understanding with the business priorities, the risks, the issues, the people, the more effective I can be to deploy legal, not just to solve problems we already have, but to work on things before they become problems and make the company a better place. I mean, that really motivates me. And I think sort of the HR experience really kind of crystallized that for me. Although in 2017, I don't think I realized this. Now, today I do. And maybe that's what my managers saw in me and why they asked me to resume in legal.
That makes sense. It sounds like the HR and business, experience on the business side really give you a much broader view of really kind of how to best do your work, even as an attorney. Um, and when you jumped into the GC role, it was, I think, looking back, probably the beginning of a turbulent period at the company, which, in California, we know there were wildfires in 2017 and 2018, and you ultimately became interim CEO for the first half of 2019. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience as interim CEO during a period of turbulence at PG&E?
Yes. And I'm still thinking about it. It all happened to me relatively quickly and with so much urgency. I don't think I've had a whole lot of time to reflect on it, but I'm now in a place where I have a bit more time. I think here's the context for this is important. I became general counsel in March of 2017 or February, sometime around the first quarter. The first round of significant wildfires was in October of 2017, followed by a series of them afterwards. And it would be a huge understatement to say it was a difficult time for the company, for our customers, for the state, for the wildfire victims. I'm very gratified that today that period also involved our filing for bankruptcy, and I'm very gratified that we're out of bankruptcy on a positive path. And I should also say I feel so fortunate to work with the amazing current CEO, Patty Poppe, that we have. So we're in a very different place today than we were when your question starts, which is in 2019. And as you mentioned, we were in a wildfire crisis, PG&E was, and a number of the devastating wildfires that you referred to started at PG&E's facilities. So there were billions and billions of dollars in claims, more than the company could pay. And that's what led to the filing of bankruptcy, which was very public. There's a book by Catherine Blunt of the Wall Street Journal called California Burning that goes into great detail about this period. And we actually used it as a source for learning in our company in our annual ethics and compliance training. So I often think about that book and the story around this from an outside view, since I'm so close to it on the inside. But as mentioned, PG&E filed bankruptcy. It was very public in early 2019. And I stepped in as interim CEO right before that happened. So my first task was to lead the company through the filing. And your question on the experience of it, I'm still thinking about it. I don't know that I can pick the best words to describe it, but sitting here today, I would describe it as being very stressful. I I felt the weight of the events, the concerns, the fears, the criticisms, the scrutiny, and the pressure of getting it right with little margin for error. I could go on here, but I also felt, and it was interesting, the support of the thousands of employees who stood with me. I think they knew we were in a crisis. They saw sort of this regular guy person who I like to think of myself as that, but I wasn't trained as a CEO. I wasn't trained in operations, but there I was. And I felt like employees stood with me in our commitment to do the right things, to get on a path to make things better, to make amends, to rebuild the company, because those are the only things you can do. You need to pick a different path. And I'm so gratified we're on that path today, but at the time I felt the weight of it, and I, like I had in my other roles, realized that we needed to bring together people, be very open with them about what was going on, and really get our best thinking, encourage our best thinking, leave some space for that to start to rebuild and get on a path. And that's what the experience was for me. I had lots of late nights, lots of worries. I have to say I'm glad I'm not I'm not in that role today. I think it's also made me a better general counsel for having gone through it, but it's not something I would have wished for.
And having been through a period in which I hope most people will not have to go through, what were some of the learnings coming out of it?
Well, there definitely, for me anyhow, lots of learnings about leading through crisis. And I've seen more than one of them. So I do feel like I'm gaining some perspective on this. I think particularly if you're the one in a leadership position around it, if you're the general counsel or you're in the legal team, or you're anywhere else in a organization where you have responsibility that's tied to crisis, I think the key learning for me is around authenticity and being yourself, especially when people are worried about what's going on, and letting your guard down enough to provide the straight talk about where we are, what happened, what's coming, and the whys behind those whats. I think doing it in an unscripted way is very important. I had many times during the interim CEO period where I was the person on the stage in front of lots and lots of people having to deliver news. And I quickly learned, though nervous that I would fumble it or say the wrong thing, that the answer was being myself and not using a script, and speaking with others like I wanted to be spoken to, and showing empathy in doing that. So absolutely, it's key when you're in crisis to get an understanding of where things are and what the plan is going forward, because people do need to understand what's coming, and they do need to have the confidence that the right things are going to come, even if you don't have all the answers. I think that's another learning. I think in my HR job, I've worked with people who, and executives in particular, who are afraid that when they talk, they might not know the answer and they'll look stupid. I think you have to quickly get over that problem. I do think you need to do the work to try to understand as best you can, but it's okay to say you don't know. And thank you for pointing out what I don't know. I'm going to go find out, because that's a good question. It's really important too to ask for help in crisis, that it does take a village, usually of different people with different perspectives. There's an interesting thing I learned in crisis too, and you don't wish a crisis for anybody, but crisis does interrupt thinking because it gets you quickly focused on what's most important and enables you, because you don't have the time to waste time to clear out the brush, and new ideas tend to come out fairly quickly, maybe from areas you wouldn't expect. I know it did for PG&E, where we started to look at things differently, which ended up becoming real engineering breakthroughs for the company and very much strengthened our safety profile. So I learned that. I learned on the need to communicate even when you don't feel like it. There was plenty of times when the last thing I wanted to do was get on the all employee call, or get up on the stage, but it's really important to keep the drumbeat of communication going so that people don't worry that there's nothing to say, which is what quickly can happen. I think another thing I learned was don't wait for the questions to be asked. Go ahead and answer them ahead of time. Between yourself and others that you can work with, you probably know what are on people's minds. And I really learned it's really helpful just to go and start to address them instead of wait for them to be asked. And usually the context for the question is worry and stress. So you can really help relieve people's stress and show empathy by reaching out and working with them where they are instead of waiting for them to come for you. I guess the last thing I'd say, because I have a lot of learnings, I'm still collating what all those are. I learned the importance of focusing on my own health. I think during those
Mm.
stressful times, there were plenty of times when I didn't put my health first, and which sometimes is hard to do. But taking some time for myself, getting some physical exercise turned out to be enormously important. I know that seems very basic, and I know our doctors tell us that, and oftentimes our coworkers tell us that, but it's easy to not do that when you're caught up in the emergency. And it takes a lot of initiative, at least it did for me, to overcome that.
Thank you. And to that last point, I think especially for lawyers, it's very easy to just be working around the clock or trying to constantly attend to clients' needs and demands. And especially when you are facing that period of crisis, I can only imagine you were probably working 20+ hour days for weeks or months on end. So very easy to experience burnout or health issues. And just to wrap up our conversation, what do you do to decompress nowadays?
Well, I try to do different things. I'm getting much better at it, including making time for my family. I think that's another thing I put in the backseat, which isn't a good thing. And so I prioritize just time to talk with my wife and my wife Carol and my daughters Isabel and Mia. I love to run. I have been a runner most of my adult life, and during the really difficult times I stopped doing that, and so I'm doing that again, although it's a bit slow going, so I'm giving myself some grace to work up to that. I love to just read and look at books and used books, and I'd say I love to do things that take my mind to a different place, that whether it's walking, running, reading,
Yes.
connecting with old friends that I knew way back when, and they knew me way back when, and remind me that I'm that person and I'm stupid and goofy and all that stuff. It's really good for me,
Yeah.
just to create opportunity to reconnect with stuff that makes me smile. And there's different things that do that, but I'm making time for that. I think there's a lot of love in the world, and it's just there. You got to sometimes find it a bit, and I've worked at that, and I feel very good about that today, where now I'm towards the end of my career, and I feel like all these things have made me better at what I do, as though sometimes they've been very difficult in the moment.
Thank you so much, John. Your career and story has been truly incredible. I think, especially given what you've been through with PG&E and just that period of intense turmoil, and then that you were able to help the company through and get the company out of bankruptcy and be where you are today. It's been really wonderful to hear, and I'm so glad that you have found more time in recent years to be with family and to do some of the things that can bring you a lot of joy. And thanks again so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed listening, learning about your career and getting a glimpse into your career and your life.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to GC's in the House. I hope you enjoyed this episode and will join me next time for an in-depth discussion with another general counsel. I welcome your feedback and recommendations for guests. You can reach me at lguo@mlaglobal.com. Please also reach out if you have any questions or comments about today's episode. Until next time.